Many critics up in arms about no strategy necessarily for ISIS in Syria. I want to bring in my guests, and I have several very smart voices on this. Jeffrey Toobin, our CNN senior legal analyst. To his left, Austin Long, who is a former political scientist with RAND Corporation, a professor at Columbia's International Public Affairs School, an analyst and advisor to the United States military in Iraq, and an expert in the Middle East. As well, Mubin Sheikh continues to join me from Toronto, a former jihadist who certainly changed his tune and has a lot of insight into what that mindset is like. And also Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, a CNN military analyst. And General, if I can start with you, when the Vice President says we will follow these ISIS killers to the gates of hell, is that rhetoric, or is this foreshadowing of some concrete military action against ISIS above and beyond what's happening with the airstrikes in Iraq?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both, Ashley, and I've been following with fascination your interviews this morning. Nick's done a wonderful job on his piece, and Mubin Sheikh is creating some very good language in his piece describing the terrorists. And what I'll tell you is the revulsion of anyone who's been in combat, who has seen the results of suicide bombings or suicide vest or beheadings, many of which I've seen in Iraq. It just tells you that you constantly are revolted by these kinds of behaviors, and I think all of the panelists have had very good points on this. Having seen what Al-Qaeda does, and this organization is much worse than anything we saw with Al-Qaeda, just shows that they truthfully have to be stopped, and they will be.
And Austin Long, weigh in on this. If ISIS wanted to wake a sleeping giant that I dare say is not necessarily sleeping, these two public beheadings certainly have a lot of attention. They have congressmen calling for action. They have the public calling for action. They have the president having to answer for what some say is inaction. Why would ISIS do this?
I think a big part of it is they get a lot of propaganda value out of it. This is a very brutal act, as people have discussed, and it's gotten a lot of attention. So if you don't believe that the United States is going to take serious military action, which until very recently it hadn't, you may believe that this may in fact convince the U.S. to back off. You
think it would convince the U.S. to back off, where some would say this is actually going to convince the U.S. to do otherwise, to ramp up its efforts to fight this force? Effectively, they may have a great propaganda tool, but they're bringing in more airstrikes. Seems a bit counterintuitive.
It's a common misperception of the United States, and the Vice President sort of alluded to it in the clip. I mean, people since Pearl Harbor have believed that the United States, when push comes to shove, will back down when it's attacked, and that's just not been the case historically, but people continue to misperceive that, I think.
And we have some pretty recent empirical evidence. After 9/11, there was no backing down. It only took, well, I think, less than a month before there was action, and there were effectively boots on the ground in Afghanistan.
And for every example like that, jihadists
And I say, by the way, I want to temper
Sure.
that. There were effectively boots.
Sure.
I witnessed them myself. We did not announce that we had boots on the ground in Afghanistan, but I met a few of them.
Certainly. The flip side is, if you're a jihadist, you can point to the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993 and the United States withdrawal there. You can point to your great victory in the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. You can point to the fact the U.S. is withdrawing. So for every example of the U.S. taking effective action, if you're so inclined, you can point to an example of superpowers being defeated by exactly these kinds of tactics.
And Mubin Sheikh, from the mindset of the jihadists, who I can only assume, have access to media. They're certainly pretty sophisticated in what they put out, so I can only assume they're sophisticated in what they have access to consume as well. Is there this notion, is it a competing notion for them? Sure, we might have some good propaganda here, but do they really want to invite the wrath of the United States?
Yeah, this look, for a lot of these groups, their decision calculus is not always well thought out. In cases that it is, it doesn't really serve their benefit or serve their interest. One of the things I think, look at their narrative. Their narrative is that, look, we're just going about our business, and suddenly the U.S. started bombing us near the Mosul Dam. So because of that, we're going to start beheading non-combatant journalists. Now, they were not just going about their business. They were expanding, they were killing, they were persecuting Christians, Yazidis, Sunni Muslims on top of that. This is something that we need to remind people of, is that more Muslims have been killed by ISIS than anyone else. And we talk about boots on the ground. It's been Sunni Muslims that are the boots on the ground that have been fighting ISIS all this time. So what they do want, in my opinion, is that they want the U.S. to come in and strike them so that they can then escalate to the next level, which is, see, the U.S. attacked us. We have no choice but to attack them there in their homeland. And this is why we're being shown these beheading videos by Western citizens. I believe the message is, if you come for us there, we're going to come for you where you are.
Jeffrey Toobin, last comment. Is there any kind of diplomatic or legal deterrent that you think a fighting force like this would actually adhere to?
You look at these crazy people, you know, executing people on television. They are not deterred by conventional means. They are not sitting around worrying about the International Criminal Court. I think the only thing that is going to deter them is if they're killed by military action. And, you know, for all the brave talk, you know, we are not fully committed we are not going to commit ground troops. There's a lot of military we're not using. And frankly, for all of the talk among politicians, they don't even want to do it either.
Jeffrey Toobin, Austin Long, thank you. Mubin Sheikh as well, thank you. And General Hertling, just excellent perspectives on this developing story, and obviously the development now with the Vice President using some pretty strong words about following ISIS to the gates of hell, because that's where they resided. Maybe how many people feel. Certainly haven't heard the administration saying it in those words. The 2 Americans beheaded by ISIS were 2 men who were kidnapped on the job. Stephen Sotloff and James Foley were journalists. They were covering events in a war zone, and it is a dangerous job. How do they balance doing their job and staying safe? How do all media outlets do this going forward, given what we know is now a strong tactic of ISIS?